The HBO series movie OG stars Jeffrey Wright as a longtime convict just approaching his release date. I'm Tony Ruiz from Gold Derby, and Jeffrey joins me. And Jeffrey, with this part, prison movies that take place in prison have such a they can so easily fall into tropes, but this one doesn't. And was that one of the things that attracted you to this part in the first place?
Well, it seemed to me from the start, when I first received the script from a friend of mine who happened to be a friend as well, Stephen Belber, the writer. It seemed to me that the premise was an authentic one, and that this film would differentiate itself from other prison films simply by the fact that we were filming in an actual working facility, a maximum security prison in Indiana called Pendleton, outside of Indianapolis, and also that we would be filming with men who are incarcerated. My co-star, Otis Carter, for example, is serving a 65-year sentence. There were others in the film who were serving life sentences. One of the extras had been on death row for 7 years. There are folks who appear in the film whose sentences run the gamut, but all for serious crimes. So this was an environment that, unlike any other film set that I had been on, and certainly I think lent the project a kind of depth and distinguishes it from other prison films in that way. Really the production designer was the state of Indiana on this. It was a very, very different experience from any other experience I've had on a film set. It was probably the most powerful experience I've had, and also the most challenging in as you might imagine. But I think just the premise itself lent to the aspects of the film that distinguish it from other prison films.
So when you prepare, I mean, a lot of actors just start with the script and then go from there. So when you prepare to do something like this, you've talked about how you spent a lot of time leading up to shooting, going to the prison and talking to the people. How did that specifically influence how you were going to play Lewis?
Well, I did. I started about a year before we started the production. I was going in to sit and meet with some of the guys, to get a sense of the place, but really more importantly, to talk with them, to exchange with them, to understand something about their stories, their experiences, not only inside the prison, but the experiences that led them to the prison. And so I went really to listen, to exchange, to get a sense too of why they would want to be a part of a project like this. And then out of that, of course, was the task of building the trust with those of the men who would end up working with us on this. So I think I went 4, 5, maybe altogether about 8 times in the year leading up to the beginning of production. And then we rehearsed for a solid week straight, and then filmed for 5 weeks, 5 weeks straight, largely 5 weeks spent inside the facility, averaging about 13 hours a day. And all of that informed my performance. Beyond that, all of that educated me a lot on issues around mass incarceration, issues around criminality, and what leads, a child that's born to a mother at some point, what leads that child on a pathway toward confinement for the course of a multi-decade sentence. So it was a heavy experience. It was an informative one, But all of those things, it was, really helped me shape the character, helped me understand who a man like him might be. And I learned insight uh, on him through the men that I worked with. Had at any given time about 100 expert consultants in in a guy serving a multi-decade sentence. They were on set, and they were willing to offer their input. They were incredibly enthusiastic about this project. They're all the guys who we were working with, huge film buffs, because as you can imagine, they have a lot of time to watch film, and they were curious about the process. Even though it's a pretty tedious day on a film set, for them it was a huge relief from the even more intense tedium of their day-to-day lives, and I think they viewed it as some ways as an opportunity for some small level of redemption. I remember one of them said early in the process, when I asked, well, why do you want to be a part of this? He said, I've got a young daughter at home, and I want her to know that I am more than this. And so I think that was that agenda was evident, in the spaces in which we work through these men. And that's not to make excuses for them. That's not to diminish the harm that they caused people, communities. But it really helped me to view them through a human lens, so that I could play this guy in a way that, as you say, pushed beyond the tropes and explored his damaged humanity.
Well, and you talk about that, that damaged humanity. You think about the fact that, the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the modern world. And one of the things that I took from the movie was the fact that there is some institutional aspect to how do we get here and how do we break that cycle? Because one of the most fascinating things about Lewis is that he is this person who wants to get out, and yet he's nervous about getting out. But then there's all these things that could easily, at any moment, you can imagine him going back, backpedaling a little bit. So how did you kind of see Lewis's arc against the backdrop of kind of these conversations that we're having about mass incarceration?
Well, it's true. The United States, for a developed nation, is the most incarcerated nation in the world, and I guess we have more prisoners, more folks behind bars than any other nation. Period. But I think what we have to remember too is that we are, among the developed countries, the most violent country in the world. So I think mass incarceration and the systemic imbalance that we see in the way people are led to the system, people remain stuck in the system, whether it be through exorbitant bails, whether it be because they lack the resources to be able to get reasonable legal representation. The ways in which certain young men are perceived by judges and by DAs relative to their potential as positive citizens. All of these things come into play. This is true. But if we take a step back too, we have a problem with crime. It's going down in our society, but we have a problem with crime. We have a problem with violence. And we particularly have a problem with those things as they relate to communities that are disadvantaged. One of the things that we take for granted, and I certainly took for granted before going into this place, was, well, certain neighborhoods, they're just more dangerous. Certain neighborhoods just more prone to crime, and if you come from certain neighborhoods, you're more likely, or the percentages are higher for you to go to prison. But as I was inside, I began to think that there are ways that we can decouple criminality and incarceration from poverty, but I don't think that there is necessarily a will. And the reason that I kind of started thinking that in that way is because I recognized that a lot of the guys that I worked with had a very similar story. They came from only a few neighborhoods in Indianapolis, for example, few low-income neighborhoods, or they came from poor rural communities. This was in Indiana, so you had a pretty even split between white and black men who were incarcerated at Pendleton. But the commonality was poverty. The commonality was absence of opportunity. Another commonality were broken families, negligent parents or drug-addicted parents. Otis, for example, was 34 when we began to film this. He was born at the height of the crack epidemic. And the crack epidemic hit low-income urban communities specifically. And if you look at some of the politics, tied to the ways in which drugs were flowing into this country from Central America and things like this, there was a very there are very specific historical drivers that led to the conditions in his community that helped shape him, helped shape his childhood, helped shape his understanding of how to move forward through the world. What helped shape his understanding of how to use the charisma and the ambition and the intellectual curiosity and all those things that he brought to bear when we worked together. But the avenues that he was shown as a child for those were destructive avenues for the most part. And so I began to think in some ways past mass incarceration, and I began to look toward trying to identify those drivers that lead a young person on the road to self-destruction, because it seemed very clear to me that a lot of these guys were in some ways incarcerated by the time they were 5 years old. Their fate had been written at that point. And so I was saying when I was doing press for the film that every politician, every legislator in this country should go to prison. Some of them may, but
I didn't say a word.
But the guys who are on the inside, the women who are on the inside, I'm sure I didn't have a chance to get to know them so intimately. They know their own stories. And some of them are actively trying to work through the missteps within their stories and work through the damage and the trauma that led them to traumatize others. But they know their stories. And if we want to understand, and if we want to legislate toward diminishing crime and violence in our society, and as a result, incarceration in our society, we'll go talk to those men and understand who they are. Because if we can understand a bit about who they are and how they were formed, we can begin to look at those kids who are coming in the down the path that led them to incarceration, and we can maybe begin to intervene in a way that helps them find some better outcomes than that. They got a lot to offer. And I think one of the things about the film is an attempt to humanize those stories in a way that we learn from them, as opposed to simply judge them and feel good about it and then move on and not solve anything.
And I think a lot of that is wrapped up in Beecher, the character that Otis Carter plays. I mean, this is a person who's never acted before and is really just terrific in this part.
Yeah.
And yet it's kind of a shame that, for a lot of people, he's only seen as a convict and not these other things that he has to offer. How did you two work together? Because you two have a really close relationship in the film.
Yeah, we work very closely together. Also in taking on this project, I was excited by the opportunity to work with these guys who had never acted on camera or on stage before, but have certainly acted in the streets before. These are all guys, and inside that facility too, who put on masks and who role play, and who use, their personalities and their charisma, as tools of influence. And so, I was excited for the opportunity to work with them and help shape their performances and help direct them in a way that would bring out their experiences, but through the artifice of this film. But at the same time, I thought I needed to assimilate more toward them than they toward me, because they obviously live this life. So it was really gratifying to work with Otis. He's a star inside that facility. He was clearly a star on the street, and he's a star in this film. And for me, it speaks to the waste. How can a guy who's capable of what he showed during this, how could a guy find himself shunned by society when he clearly has something more to offer than the life of a criminal? So again, it led me back to what led him there. For Otis, for example, said that when he was 11 or 12, he was living in a house in Indianapolis with a bunch of other guys of similar age and some older, gang members. His mother was in Chicago, and his father was absent. His father may have been killed at some point. His mother had a drug problem. So there he was with a group of mentors who, for whatever reason, didn't have the most productive intent in their tutelage of him. So here he is, but he's more than that, as he showed in this film, and intense guy. One of the most intense, probably the most intense performer I've ever worked with. There were some moments together with him that were that took everything I could to navigate through and funnel toward the camera. Yeah.
And you've had some experience working with intense actors, so
yeah, I've worked with a lot of them. Yeah, they've never worked with Otis Carter. They would have to step it up a level, even the great ones. Yeah.
So I want to ask about the end of the film, because I loved the end of I loved the way this movie ended, in a way that didn't expect to. Did you leave in that last scene? Did you have an idea in your mind? Because it's left very unanswered about what the future holds for Lewis. Did you have an idea in your mind? Did you and Madeline Sackler, the director, did you guys talk about where you thought Lewis would be, or was it just in that moment?
In my mind, he was walking out the door. And that was it. And let's see what the day brings. And I think that's, that ambiguity is in many ways the purpose of the film. What now? What do we do with these men that we have punished and we have turned our backs on, justifiably so perhaps, but what do we do when they get out? Has the decades of incarceration served the interests of society, or the opposite? Do they come out more likely to be constructive citizens, or do they come out more likely to return to prison, either for violating parole or for other violent acts that do harm? And what have we, as society, provided them as tools toward their rehabilitation and the restoration of their humanity? The ambiguity was intentional, but in playing it was just walking out the door. And that was one thing that I never took for granted while we were filming there. At the end of each day, once the day's work was done, the gate opened and I could leave. Most of my colleagues could not, and I never underappreciated that. And even as we talk now, most of them are still inside there. Time stopped for them. It's something not to overlook.
Yeah. Well, you don't in this movie. Jeffrey Wright, thank you so much. The OG airs on HBO, and log on to goldderby.com and make your predictions for the Emmys, Oscars, Grammys, Tonys, and stay tuned for more awards contender interviews later this season. Jeffrey Wright, thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, take care.